Hello, Internet, and welcome to another edition of Movies Are Boring, the only web show where two defense journalists sit and talk about pop culture and the movies. As always, I'm your host, Matthew Galt, and with me this time I have a very special guest, the rake at the gates of hell, the Hellblazer himself, John Constantine, live via satellite over YouTube. Please say something, John.
Man, I can't do a British accent
You can't
otherwise.
do a British accent? Okay.
No.
You busted the illusion. With me, actually, as always, is my co-host, the man, the myth, the man who shaved his beard for a Halloween costume, Kevin Nodell. Say hello, Kevin.
I
So are you watching the John Constantine show, the Hellblazer?
it is not the Hellblazer. It's all right. It's fun, but it is not the Hellblazer.
That's sad. I will have to try it out soon. I've not watched it yet. Tonight may be a good night for it though. Down to business. Last week we talked about military horror movies. Specifically, we talked about the movie Dog Soldiers. There's one kind of military horror movie out there is the creature feature that uses the military kind of as a backdrop or as the heroes. Think Predator, Dog Soldiers obviously was the example we used. This week we're going to get a little bit deeper into the military horror movies that I think are more effective and far scarier. I'm talking about the psychological thrillers. Now, in particular, we're going to look at two movies. One is House from 1986. The most famous person I think that is in that is probably George Wendt, who people may remember from the movie Cheers. And we will also be discussing the far superior, in my opinion, film Jacob's Ladder from 1990, starring Tim Robbins, and also Jason Alexander and Louis Black had a small role. But we're going to dive all into this right now. Kevin, you helped me kind of pick the movies. What did you think of Jacob's Ladder right off the top of your head?
Pro tip: don't watch it before you go to sleep. You get weird dreams and you're disoriented until noon the next day.
Really? Okay, so Jacob's Ladder, for people who haven't seen it, and everyone really should go see this movie. It's amazing. Tim Robbins is a Vietnam veteran. He's estranged from his wife. He's got one of his children is dead, and he's having flashbacks to Vietnam and also seeing things as he's walking about in the daylight hours, seeing what he describes as demons that are coming for him. And there's a little bit of some government conspiratorial stuff in there and things like that. But it is pretty horrifying. And as Kevin said, yeah, don't watch it before you go to sleep. I thought about that last night. I started to watch it and it was like midnight. And I got about 20 minutes in. I was like, no, I'm gonna do this in the morning. I'm gonna wuss out and I'm gonna watch this in the morning because I don't want to have these horrifying demons in my brain as I'm going to sleep.
It's not even so much that because it's too scary or disturbing, it's just that it's such a disorienting, weird movie that it just makes your dreams weird.
Because of there's a lot of camera tricks and a lot of questioning of what's real and what's not. Is that the kind of stuff you're talking about, like the flashing lights and that kind of stuff?
That kind of thing, yeah.
Do you recall any of the nightmares that you had?
Huh?
Do you recall any of the nightmares that you had by chance?
Well, no. Well, I mean, it wasn't nightmares so much as just weird dreams and just kind of feeling unusually groggy and unusually unable to get it together when I woke up.
The other movie we watched is House from 1986, which is directed by Steve Miner.
Which is about a Vietnam veteran who's estranged from his wife and has a dead son, oddly enough.
Yeah, they are. As I was watching Jacob's Ladder this morning, I was like, it's very strange because they're both so similar. In House, though, the way he decides to deal with, he's actively kind of trying to deal with these issues. And he's a writer, he writes horror novels. And he takes over, his aunt has committed suicide, and she's the woman that had raised him. He moves into her house after her death and decides that he's going to sit down and he's going to write his Vietnam memoir. And he's going to get all of this out of his system. And it's also coincidentally the place where his son disappeared. So he's haunted by those visions as well. Um, Whereas Jacob's Ladder is a very taut, psychological, serious thriller, House is like it's a little Evil Dead, right?
Hmm.
It's a little schlocky. It's fun. I enjoyed it, but it's not. It's a lot of it's kind of played for comedy in that way that some '80s horror did, and it's fun and it's effective, but it didn't grab me in quite the same way.
Right.
So you picked House. Will you tell me a little bit why that one struck you when we were talking about this earlier on?
Well, I remember seeing it a long time ago, and I remember when I saw it, I saw the second half of it, or more like the last third of it, when he's facing down with Big Ben, that whole sequence, and tried to get his son back. Um, and it is very schlocky, but it also is very about facing your demons.
Right. In a
Um,
way that Jacob's Ladder kind of is about release. This one's about fighting.
right.
You know?
And also, it happened. I happened to see it on Netflix, and it was just right there on Instant View, and it just seemed like a really, really convenient thing to do. So I watched it.
It felt fortuitous. Yeah, I'm glad you did.
Hmm.
So at the back half of House, for the people that haven't seen it, and it is on Netflix, as Mr. Constantine has just said. Um, During in Vietnam, he had a friend named it was Big Ben, right?
Yeah,
He was like the big guy that had what kind of weapon? The kind of
the M60, the
yeah,
big
yeah,
ass machine gun.
yeah, the big huge M60 who died, or his friend thought, or Cobb, who's the main character, thought his friend Big Ben had died in Vietnam. He's confronted by the zombified spirit of that in this house and kind of has to face down his survivor skill, really. Isn't that kind of what's going on here?
I
Is
think so.
he left somebody behind in Nam, and he the zombie implies that the Viet Cong captured him and tortured him for years, and that he was alive for a very long time before he died. Um, and it's Cobb is facing down his survivor's guilt, which I thought was a very serious moment in what was kind of overall a little bit of a wacky movie, right?
Hmm.
There's also a lot of stuff that happens in House that doesn't make a whole lot of sense. Um,
The whole babysitting bit was very strange.
yeah, there's a woman that lives next door to Cobb, and she's very sexy and seductive, and she's obviously kind of trying to play him a little bit. And she shows up she shows up late at night one night, dressed as if she's going to go out and kind of trying to seduce him. And as he starts to kind of play into it, she says, "Okay, great, here, watch my kid for me," and then takes off. Which just seemed like a really convenient way for him to like have an adventure with a kid in the house, trying to keep the monsters from killing it.
Hmm.
And there's a whole bunch of that kind of stuff in this movie, things that kind of happen just because the director and the writer thought they would look neat, right?
Hmm.
A lot of monster battles and that kind of thing. Um, I want to talk more about Jacob's Ladder, though, because it is very much the same, like a Vietnam veteran, dealing with his post-traumatic stress, dealing with losing people in the war, but in a very different way than House does it, right?
Yeah,
How long had it been since you'd seen Jacob's Ladder?
a long time.
Yeah, I'd seen it in when I was in high school, over 15 years ago, and it was a lot different. It was a much different experience this time, right?
Right. It's scarier now.
Yeah, it's way scarier. I can't. I don't even know how to like. Some of the stuff that's in there, I don't even have the words for. It's so frightening, and what Tim Robbins goes through is so horrifying and hard. At the end of the film, I felt, I was affected by it in a way that movies don't typically affect me. Um, do you think that there is? What do you think about using these kinds of movies, like these horror movies, as a way for people who saw combat to work through their stress and work through what happened?
Eh.
No?
I mean, honestly, um, these aren't war movies. These are horror movies that use war as a backdrop, and I don't think um, veterans or people with post-traumatic stress disorder are really the target audience here. They're just using that as a plot device more. I mean, it's not like I don't necessarily think that's a terrible thing, but it's just artists seeing something that exists in life and seeing that it relates to what they're kind of talking about and using it. And I think with Jacob's Ladder, they evoke the legacy of other things like they don't directly mention it, but like Agent Orange and experiments that people went through, because that's one of the things they keep talking about, whether this was an experiment, whether the army did something to them or not.
Just to kind of tell everyone that's watching, so in Jacob's Ladder, Jake, the main character, he's having all these hallucinations, meets up with some of his old war buddies, and realizes that they're all having similar hallucinations as well. And that they kind of figure out that perhaps the government sprayed them with something or put something in their food, which on the surface sounds crazy if you're unfamiliar with actual history, in which it's happened a lot. Like I think the CIA's Project MK Ultra, the Tuskegee Airmen. It is not unheard of for the American military to experiment on its soldiers and on civilians. Correct?
Well, I would say it's a lot more uncommon now, but
yes,
at various points in history, no, it was not as uncommon and not as crazy.
So you kind of.
And it also, I mean, this is a coincidence, but it did strike me. I thought about this, but then I looked at when it was actually made, and it doesn't play into this at all because it was 1990. But it did make me think a lot about Gulf War syndrome. But this movie was in fact made a year before the Gulf War happened. So
explain Gulf War syndrome to the people who may not know what it is.
I'm trying to think of how, because the Gulf War syndrome doesn't have a solid definition really.
Okay.
It's just the series of problems that veterans of the Gulf War, Desert Storm reported having, and there's no like central definition of what that actually is. They've reported a lot of different symptoms, like shortness of breath. Some of them seeing things, just various different health problems, and different explanations that have been presented are whether they handled depleted uranium munitions, whether that could have caused some of these symptoms, or whether just being out in those oil fields while they were burning could have used their lungs, done things to their body, or being subjected to being near chemical weapons that Saddam used, whether they were in an area where chemical weapons had been used, maybe after effects of that affected people. But the government has never really acknowledged Gulf War syndrome as a thing, also because there isn't really a real definition for what it is or what causes it. But it's been an issue in veteran circles about weird, unexplained things that happen. And there are documented cases that there are health problems that veterans of the Gulf War have that other people don't have as commonly. So there were consequences of serving in that environment, but there aren't real good definitions for what that is. But that's something that's happened in a lot of different wars, like Vietnam, for instance, with Agent Orange. Some people getting symptoms, some people not. And I think this movie plays into that a lot more with Vietnam and those questions.
And again, it's happening now too. The New York Times had a very great feature piece that they ran maybe a month ago, maybe a little bit less.
Yeah, C.J. Chivers' piece.
Yeah, exactly. About the soldiers coming home from Iraq now that have been exposed to the chemical weapons left behind by Saddam, right? So it's kind of something that happens with I feel like with modern wars, right? Kind of since World War One and Two, that we've seen soldiers coming home with strong psychological effects that are sometimes tied to the chemicals that are used in the field, right?
Mm-hmm.
Which is ultimately in Jacob's Ladder. It has a postscript. They blame, not really blame, but they mention kind of offhand that some people say that the American military used BZ ordnance during Vietnam, and that's what's caused Jacob's hallucinations. The Pentagon has denied that. Joseph Trevithick, one of our fellow writers, has written a piece about BZ just a few weeks ago, or just about a week ago or so, that kind of explained what it works, and it kind of the Jacob's Ladder stuff is a very movieized version of what BZ can do to somebody, right? Because it usually just makes people really irritable, and they don't, or
I don't know that because in this it makes them hyper aggressive versus just irritable and not wanting to do anything. So yeah, it actually had the opposite effect of what Joe was writing about.
Like I said, it's the Hollywood dream nightmare version of that kind of stuff.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, if this is not, if these kinds of movies are not an effective means for therapy for veterans, let's say, then what do you think about them as a way for audience members to, obviously they want to see a good horror movie, but to also kind of understand?
I think it's far better at that. I think it helps remind audiences that these issues do exist. Maybe it's a schlocky way of doing it, but it at least puts it out there and could lead to a constructive conversation. Maybe not. There's a lot of misunderstanding about PTSD and what it is and how it works. I'm not sure that these movies necessarily help, but at the same time, like the things that these people are experiencing in these movies, while both characters do suffer from PTSD, it becomes clear as it goes on that PTSD is not responsible for what's happening.
That's true. There is an external source for what they're going through.
Yeah, for both of them, they're not. Well, okay. In Jacob's Ladder, he is seeing things. The things aren't real. In House, they are real to a point. And other people can see them once he actually introduces them to it. But they are manifestations of his guilt. They become real because of his repressed emotions, but they are real.
Right, but in Jacob's Ladder, they're real too, but they're real only. I don't know. It's hard without kind of giving away the ending of the movie, which I think is kind of a beautiful ending. I thought. I would say in Jacob's Ladder that stuff that he's seeing is real. It's just a show just for one, though, and that doesn't make it any less real to me. Mm-hmm. What about you? This is kind of an odd thing I noticed. In both of the movies, their civilian identities kind of get destroyed as the film moves along. They both end up towards the end of the movies in portions of their uniforms from Vietnam. Did you notice that?
I did.
Tim Robbins is a mailman, changes his mail uniform for his dog tags and his army jacket. And the Cobb, who's the main character in House, does the same thing. I thought that was kind of an interesting take where these guys are having trouble adjusting to life on the home front, start going back to that military life, right? Start kind of grabbing onto the last place that, like, perhaps they felt stable or felt order. Does that feel right, or am I completely off base?
I think sort of. I think as a plot device, it's more, particularly more with House. It's not so much order. It's because there's such a lack of order. It's put him back in fighting mode more than like order mode. Though actually, now that you mention it, and I guess I didn't really think about it, but that is something I think I've noticed with veterans too. During some of those times, you might see them like wearing fatigues and stuff a little bit more, and also when people, like usually around the time that people get out. This is something that actually Terminal Lance pointed out in one of his comics, and he explained it in a blog post. It's the uniform of the post 9/11 veteran, and it's always khaki cargo pants, ball cap, and Oakley sunglasses.
Right.
Which is how a lot of post 9/11 veterans look even after the service. And the way he explained it is they wear the cargo pants because their military uniform had cargo pants, and it's where they can put all their stuff that they might need, because you never know what you might need.
Right.
It's also a place to put they can put their hat in their cargo pocket when they go inside, because it's a subtle thing and civilians won't necessarily notice it, but a lot of military people will take their hat off when they go indoors because that's what they've done for the past however long they were in the military.
That's interesting. How many? You know quite a few veterans, right?
Mm-hmm.
How do you know any that do suffer from PTSD? You were talking about the misconceptions, and how poorly understood the condition is. And I was wondering if you would elaborate on that. I know that's kind of going off movies, but I think that's kind of an important topic.
Well, yeah, I think. Well, a lot of ideas that people get about post-traumatic stress disorder they get from movies and television.
Right.
And one of the most common tropes is the ticking time bomb vet, which I'm not going to say that doesn't exist.
And that's kind of a trope that these movies play on, right? And you see that in the faces of the other people that are watching the events unfold from the outside, the other characters in both films.
Mm-hmm.
Specifically, I'm thinking George Wendt, who plays Cobb's neighbor in House, and Tim Robbins' girlfriend. And then, sorry.
Hmm?
You were saying ticking time bomb?
Yeah. Well, actually, and also, I think I guess this actually is an effective thing about both movies, is that these people were suffering from PTSD, but were not necessarily unhinged people. Actually, there were external sources that were exacerbating things, but as people, they were actually pretty well adjusted. They just needed to work through some things, which is, I think, a better way of explaining PTSD. I mean, in movies, people have these flashbacks, and flashbacks can be vivid, but it's not as though people with PTSD are seeing things that aren't there. It's not as though they're just completely unhinged and don't have it together. It's just coping with these experiences. And I mean, I haven't really suffered it, so I can't really explain how it is, but I've definitely lived with guys who suffered with PTSD. I got to have a front row seat of that. It's just not quite what people think it is. It's not, and a lot of times it's not necessarily. It doesn't result in aggression so much as a sort of powerlessness that I think sometimes these guys feel. I don't know, and also what's important is there is no one size fits all definition of what PTSD is. It affects different people in different ways depending on what their trauma is, who they are, what their life experiences were before they experienced that trauma, and how all of them cope with it.
Okay.
It's a very big topic.
Right. It's a broad span. It's a broad spectrum.
Like we could keep talking about this for hours.
Well, I don't think the audience would care for that. Maybe they would. Maybe someone will tell us that they would like to hear us discuss that. But
maybe some other time. But
right. Then, do you think these movies give a fair shake to that to the soldiers that fought and came back, or do you think that this kind of thing is a little bit crass?
I think it is. I mean, at the end of the day, these movies weren't designed to be necessarily for healing.
No,
not at all. But I don't think they were. I don't consider either of them to be overly crass. The more I think about them, I think with Vietnam being more recent,
right,
and with PTSD being something that people were finally starting to talk about right around the time that movie was released, actually, because it's 1981, I believe.
It was 86, actually.
Okay. Oh, wow. I was way but
and he wrote Jacob's Ladder, the screenwriter did, in 1980, but they could not get it made. It took him 10 years to find someone to make it.
Okay.
He had to sell several other scripts before someone finally picked up Jacob's Ladder.
Okay. All right, that helps me orient that. But yeah, I think that particularly with House, it is part of this wave of movies in the 80s where Vietnam veterans were the hero. That was a trend that really started in the 80s, and not just in film but in television. You had Magnum P.I. Magnum was a Vietnam vet, and he had all his Vietnam vet buddies living in Hawaii. I think this was part of that period of time where people realized, man, we really didn't treat veterans very good back then, did we?
So it's kind of like Hollywood apologizing en masse for poor treatment or perceived poor treatment of veterans during the actual war. But now that it's over, we can make them heroes and give them a fair shake.
I think so. I think that was a big part of it, and I think that kind of fits into our discussion we had about Rambo, which. I mean, Rambo's not necessarily the best depiction of PTSD.
No.
I mean, interesting film, as we talked at length about. But I mean, that actually, if we go back to PTSD for a minute, I think that kind of is. Rambo is the PTSD stereotype that I think a lot of people walk away with.
Yeah. Got a dog that's freaking out here a little bit. I apologize.
That's okay. He's on the ladder.
Possibly. Anyway, yeah, the Rambo is kind of when people think about PTSD and returning veterans, that's the image they go to automatically.
Yeah.
They think that one of these guys is going to be dangerous and is going to hurt people, essentially.
And this is something that's interesting. This is a statistic. They've done. Well, I don't have the actual statistic, but it was a high number. I believe it actually was more than 50. A lot of employers right now, despite saying they support the troops and are supportive of the military, are hesitant to hire veterans because they are afraid of PTSD in the workplace. Really?
I have not heard that. Where did you? Do you remember who saw that?
I don't remember who did the study. I think I saw a mention of it in an article that Alex Horton wrote. I've actually seen it mentioned in several articles that veterans have written, and it was about the appreciation culture and how the appreciation culture is in many ways hollow, where people will, on the one hand, say thank you for your service, but then say, but I don't need you working here, and if you could go somewhere else where I don't have to think about the war or what you may have experienced, that would be great.
Yeah, just a quick Google search gives me like a Fortune magazine article and a Forbes article about that. So that's like I had not heard that. That's kind of interesting and awful.
But also not surprising to me.
No, yeah. I mean, companies care about the bottom line. If there's perceived negative stereotypes about a group, then it's going to affect their hiring practices. That's just unfortunate, though. Because most of the vets that I've worked with and have hired and other jobs that I've worked have been outstanding employees, far better than most of the other people I've hired. So, Jacob's Ladder. Do you play many video games? Or you don't recently?
No, but you can't not see the connection with Silent Hill.
Yes. I thought that was, as I was watching the movie, it really hit me that, because Silent Hill is one of my favorite video game franchises. And Silent Hill is a video game franchise on mostly the PlayStation consoles. I think there was a few on the Xbox. And there was two major motion pictures. One of them was halfway decent, the other one was crap. But when you watch Jacob's Ladder, you can see the direct line to Silent Hill and how much they lifted out of that movie and used in those games. Which is probably one of the reasons why I like this movie so much on the second viewing.
That dog is very loud right now.
I know, I'm sorry.
It's all right.
She's attention-starved, poor little dog. Yes. All right, sir. Well, do you have any final words of wisdom you'd like to say about House or about Jacob's Ladder?
No, not really. I think we covered most of what we needed to talk about.
Let me ask you this. Do you think that this is... I mean, it's not going to stop, and we kind of already talked about it a little bit, but do you think that these are the most effective ways that we can use horror in military films? Are these kind of like Jacob's Ladder and House, or do you think that there's better ways to tell horror stories about war? Or do you think that war is horrifying enough and there don't need to be horror movies about them?
I don't see any reason why there can't be.
Right.
I think there can be better ways of doing it than what happened in these movies. I think there are more effective ways of doing it, which isn't to say that these movies aren't good films in their own right, and I don't necessarily see either of them as being insulting movies. But yeah, I think it's something that I would like to see continue. I have no problem with it. I think war is horrifying enough, and certainly realistic depictions of war and how things really are versus using horror as a way of telling it would also be good. But I also don't discourage us from tackling these issues, whether it be through horror, science fiction, or fantasy, or whatever genre. Whatever helps people tackle these issues, I think is good.
Have you seen Fury yet?
No, I still have not seen Fury.
It's very, very... If you're going to see one horror movie this weekend, see Fury. Because I think that was a horror movie. Absolutely.
Well, it sounds like the original one really was a horror movie.
Oh, that was an unpleasant script read. I'm really glad they made all of the changes they made. They left all the right things on the cutting room floor. And if you don't know what I'm talking about, you can check out my most recent article about Fury, which is on the website medium.com/war-is-boring. This has been Movies Are Boring. My name is Matthew Galt. With me, as always, is the man, the myth, the guy missing his beard, which is really upsetting me, Kevin Nodell. Say goodbye, Kevin.
Goodbye, Kevin.
And we will see you guys next month with more movies and more discussion. Thank you very much.